Hey everyone, welcome to Redefining HR podcast. I'm your host, Lars Schmidt, and today I'm excited to be joined by Michael Ehret. Michael is the head of global talent management for Johnson & Johnson, and I have a lot of questions about what it's like to run global talent management at an organization like Johnson & Johnson. So Michael, thanks so much for coming on the podcast. I'd love to have you open with an introduction for the audience.
Lars, thanks so much for having me on Redefining HR. I'm really honored to join you today. As a little bit of a means of introduction, I'm the head of global talent management, as you said, for Johnson & Johnson. I started my career in finance. I worked a couple of years in a rotational leadership program and ended up doing a cross-functional rotation in HR, in performance management, and sort of fell in love with this notion of how I might be able to help people and organizations optimize their performance. And over the last 20 years, post that, I've kind of bounced back and forth between HR business partner roles and roles in talent, primarily in leadership development, across 3 different companies, all within healthcare. And I've lived and worked in all 4 regions and studied on leadership quite a bit. So that's just a little bit of context and background on me.
Yeah, I mean, what was it about leadership specifically that drew you in? You mentioned you've worked in a few different roles, but that was an area that tends to be kind of a common theme throughout your career.
You know, if you'll allow me to tell you a quick story, a little bit of an origin story for me and my passion for leadership, it kind of dates back to I was 13 years old. I was in an 8th grade pre-algebra class, right, with a teacher named Vit Piskuskas. And I don't remember much about pre-algebra, but I can distinctly remember this moment during his class where he stopped his regular flow and he wrote on the chalkboard. And I share a chalkboard to maybe date myself a bit because there were chalkboards back then. And he wrote on the board, essentials to success: communication skills, confidence, and sense of humor. And not that I would prescribe that those are the be all end all, elements or essentials for success, but for my, evolving 13-year-old brain, this hit me like a bolt of lightning. I thought, wow, like I just have to follow these 3 things and I'll be successful. That's awesome. And it sort of sent me on this fascination and lifelong pursuit of sort of trying to study and understand and ultimately try to practice great leadership. And I'm just so enamored with the notion of leadership and how, great leaders can help, manage energy for themselves and for their organizations.
Yeah, I mean, it's so interesting. I think when you have conversations like this on the podcast, some people fell into the field by happenstance. Some people evolved into the role they're in now. And it's interesting hearing an origin story like yours when, way back as a 13-year-old, the seeds were planted that kind of set you on this path. Let's talk about Johnson & Johnson. I think, most of the audience is, I imagine, familiar with Johnson & Johnson as a company, likely, users of many of the Johnson & Johnson brands, but probably not a good sense of the operations of Johnson & Johnson. And so I'd love to kind of calibrate there, if you will, a bit. Could you give an overview of the business, headcount, global footprint, operations, and things like that, just to help give a little bit more context to the organization?
Sure. I think most of your listeners probably would have some recognition of Johnson & Johnson and largely probably associate the brand with our consumer health products. So Band-Aids or Listerine or Neutrogena. And Johnson & Johnson is actually the broadest based and largest healthcare company in the world. And I think, that story starts more than 135 years ago. I love the history of big companies and these big kind of American franchises and icons. And I might start with the son of our founder, Robert Wood Johnson II, who in 1943 wrote this brilliant statement, which we still, by and large, in an unchanged way, refer to today, which is called our credo. And back before the company, it was a good year plus before the company went public, Robert Wood Johnson made some declarations around the constituencies in which we serve. And that starts with our patients and our consumers and their mothers and fathers, and then our employees and our communities. And you can imagine for a company in the 40s to be talking about ESG and commitment and giving back to the community, it was pretty novel. And then finally, if we do all those 3 things right, our shareholders. So, even before the company went public, there was a very clear delineation of values and purpose. And now 136 or 37 years later, as I stated, we're the largest healthcare company in the world. We work across 3 different sectors. So there's the consumer health sector, there's our medical technology sector, and our pharmaceutical sector. The company right now is in the midst of separating out the consumer health business from the other 2 sectors. So we'll have 2 standalone companies over the next several months. And we've got about 140,000 plus employees. We operate in 85 plus countries, so virtually everywhere around the world. You can look up maybe some of the financials online. I'm not sure if you want to get into that, but I'm happy to share any more context. We touch over 1 billion people's lives every day in big and small ways. So as you might tell from the passion in my voice, I love working at this company. I love working in healthcare because of that impact and the ability to help extend and enhance people's lives, in every day. Yeah.
Well, I mean, so you're operating certainly at a scale that is, not many HR leaders have a chance to operate and touch an employee base that large with that broad of a global footprint. And so your role leading talent management at an organization like that, what does that look like? Like, how is your team structured? What does your team's headcount look like? How are you kind of organized in a way that supports the range of lines of business and locations where you operate?
Yeah, sure. My role and the scope of that role, we in global talent management, my function, we serve the enterprise. Yeah. And the scope of that starts with acquisition and access strategy and policy. So how do we go about accessing and acquiring the best talent in the world? We have several million applicants every year. We fill about 35,000 positions a year. So there's high volumes. It's a big machine we need to run. The second part of my role is enterprise learning and development. So it's really focused on setting direction for how people learn and grow. How do we define good learning? How do we measure it, et cetera? But also the technology behind connecting people to things that they care about, that they can immediately learn and apply. So enterprise learning and development's a second big part of that machine. And then I have 4 centers of excellence across the company. So I have succession management. At the beginning of this year, we just named the 8th CEO in our 136-year company. So from a business continuity or leadership continuity, we're really proud of our track record there, and I get to be part of that process. I lead performance management, I lead our assessment practice, and then I have people analytics. So I have those 4 COEs and then those 2 big parts of our talent machine.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think each of those COEs could probably be its own podcast conversation in terms of the complexity and scale where you operate. But I want to hone in on an element of one of them, which is kind of upskilling and reskilling. And, we're kind of in these very dynamic times right now where the shelf life of skills is declining. The ability to really embrace kind of agile learning practices is so essential to maintain and develop and ultimately retain your workforce. Walk me through how you think about that, because especially obviously working on the global scale that you are, and it could be the approach, the practice, technology you use, but how do you think about kind of upskilling and reskilling and continuous learning in Johnson & Johnson?
Yeah, what an awesome question, Lars. I mean, I think that's something that we think about and I think about every day. And I think we're in the midst of a significant transformation as a community of HR leaders, which is, moving from large scale, scalable programs and programmatic development and growth to high personalization. I think that starts with an element you said, which is skills are changing so fast, and the proficiency and expectation of the skills are changing so fast. One thing that will continue to be important for people to be successful is learning agility and being able to, continuing to learn and grow and acquire new skills. I think this starts with some regards in partnership with the business of defining what are those hot skills. So it may not be a library of 400 skills, but what are the few skills that are going to be so important in jobs and job families? And then how can we connect people to growth opportunities beyond maybe a traditional training? So it's not about, signing up and you pass a certificate or a proficiency level, but how do you wrap around a combination, not prescription, of development and growth around people, which includes experiential, so the jobs that you're doing, but also the gigs, the projects that you can do in your current job. And it connects to mentorship. It connects to, certainly a myriad of ways in which people learn, whether it be by video or books or programs or whatever it be. And how do we take this massive amount of content that's now available to us at a relatively, or I would say a much lower price point than it has ever been, if not free from before, and connect that to the individual level? And, it's one of the things I'm most proud of in terms of our accomplishments this year is we recently launched our first digital talent marketplace, where based on the information that we can garner on people and what they share with us. So based on the job that you're in, we can make some inference around the skills that you have, but you can also sort of share what are the skills that you're interested in focusing on. What are your aspirations from a career path perspective? And then through artificial intelligence and machine learning, we're starting to connect people and make it really easy for them to access those things I talked about. So personalized and curated learning and mentorships and gigs, and ultimately, as we get into next year, jobs and pathways. So we call this personalization at scale, because we want to be fair and consistent and provide equitable access to people, but it's navigating things in a far easier, more consumer grade way.
Yeah, and how is that a tool that you built in-house, or are you using a third party to support that?
Yeah, so you talked about Agile before, Lars. I mean, this is new for us. I mean, it wasn't all that long ago where we would create a learning or leadership development program, and it would take many, many months, if not longer. And I think the speed in which we're super proud at J&J, the fact that we created from inception to commercialization or access a vaccine, and we did that in a year. No longer is it acceptable to take a year to design a first-line leader program. So we've had to evolve, just like the business has, to do things in a more agile and fast manner. And so we've worked with a number of third party, especially on the technical side, partners. We've licensed some skills libraries that we can use, and we've linked it all up so that that's all seamless to our users. They don't know how many partners and technology we're using. It just looks like one big red front door for learning for Johnson & Johnson. But yeah, that's all sort of come together in the, as you said, agile way. It's not perfect. We don't have it all figured out, but it's minimally viable product, pilot, test, learn, evolve, launch, continuing to iterate. It's very, I think probably consistent in some of the places that you've worked and led in your history, right? Rather than maybe a large, big company that you might think about.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I'm, for those of you who are listening and not watching, you can't see it, but I'm smiling as you describe that, because I think so much of what you describe is how I think about the field of modern HR today, right? Like, not that long ago, if you connected the word personalization with scale, people would freak out, right? I think that the field of HR came from a place of being somewhat formulaic and playbook driven and iterative. And as you mentioned, rolling out those programs and policies, I mean, that could be 18 months, right, before something is live. And then it's a whole different world by the time it actually hits. And so the need for speed, the need for shipping it, iterating, the need for agile is so much a fundamental part of the new world of work that we're building now. And I'm curious for you, you talked a little bit about kind of being more skills based from a learning standpoint, a development standpoint. Does that kind of carry over to recruiting at all? And what I mean by that is I think recruiting historically has been very role based, right? We have a specific role in mind. We have a job description that is, written very tailored to the hiring manager's specific needs in that area. And obviously that model of hiring doesn't necessarily account for what a candidate wants to do, what they're good at, what they enjoy. It's kind of based more of like, here's their inventory of experience from a resume or a LinkedIn profile. And we have the opportunity now to think a lot differently about that. So I'm curious, like, has that impacted at all kind of how you recruit and maybe focused maybe more on skills than skills and interests and kind of aptitude than just kind of experience and past work.
Yeah, I mean, I think skills for us, are an incredible equity opportunity. And you're right. I mean, we can all sort of envision the job descriptions or requisitions of the past where there would be this element of the description of the job and the years of experiences required and the educational requirements and all these sort of elements. I think skills gives us, or has the opportunity to give us, a little bit of a common language and an expectation that I think creates greater equity and greater access, right, to talent than maybe it has in the past. So we're not entirely there yet. And I know that there's other companies that may be working towards an entirely skills-based talent economy, and we're not quite there. I mean, we know that skills is important and is increasingly more important, but there are things that are also important as well, like behavioral attributes, leadership. There are experiences, especially in very technical jobs, where experiences and academic elements will continue to be prerequisites. But I think the transition is around, if we can create this common languages of what's really expected for people to do in a job, right? And then bring them into an ecosystem like Johnson & Johnson's, where we have an incredible learning and development operation. Let's bring in people with some of those attributes of learning agility and resilience and persistence and drive and empathy and, some of the behavioral stuff, do a baseline assessment of skills, right? And then bring them into Johnson & Johnson, and we can grow them, right, for hopefully a long, long time, given the myriad of development opportunities we have. So it's fundamentally changing not just how we train and develop people, but how we hire and access people, how we and I think access is a really important point of this. Is it's no longer about hiring people directly into your P&L, but thinking about the mix of talent that may be available. 40% of the U.S. workforce is now contingent labor, right? So how do you sort of create this consistency around what are the skills we need to be able to do these jobs, and then thinking very differently about what the right mix is in terms of how you access that talent. So I think skills are fundamentally changing recruiting, access, learning, and in many companies, there's companies that are probably far ahead of us, and this could be even compensation and how you pay people. So it really is it feels like a big transformation that we're in the midst of as a community, an HR community.
I think it's such an exciting time because, to your point right there, I mean, this is a new world of work that we're building, and you and your contemporaries are the architects of the new world of work. You're the ones kind of designing what this looks like, how this works, and it's such a big fundamental shift from these industrial era constructs of how, when, and where we work that we've been working under for decades. And now it is something new, and exactly where it will end up, I think we don't know. Lots of things have changed. Lots of things will continue to change. But it's exciting because so much of what is being built now is being built now, as opposed to just the version of how we did things in a slightly different way 5 years ago. How about you for yourself? I mean, you talk about learning agility, and I think you have such an interesting role because the complexity of business from an HR and people standpoint is significant. But you layer that with the complexity of business from an external standpoint, a geopolitical standpoint, a social justice and equity standpoint. There's so many external factors as well that are impacting society and the world, while also kind of we're managing that with the people side of our business and all the change. Where do you go to kind of, for your own learning and to stay on top of trends, both within the field and external trends that may impact the business?
Yeah, as I said before, it's an incredible age and time that we're living in, given the ability to access information in easy ways. And I think about different channels for information to flow in. So I always think that strategy and that architecture that you talked about, Lars, has to be fueled. The gas to that engine, or the electricity to that engine, is going to be these external insights, deep customer market, external insights that are pretty regularly fed to you. So, the cool thing is you can set this up in a really systemic way. You can subscribe to podcasts like Redefining HR and other I would call them more regular intervals of in-depth understanding. I think even your LinkedIn feed. I think, setting your Google News or your Apple News to the right settings. It's almost like, what might have been 20 years ago where you would start your day reading the Wall Street Journal to see what's going on. We can now have 4 or 5 different information streams open, and we can scan that in minutes. What's interesting, what are you going to save for later? And it's just so efficient, right? But I love going a little bit deeper in conversations and listening to you and others kind of talk to other I think there's so much to be learned. There's a great quote, and I'm going to misrepresent the person. He's a science fiction author who said, "The future is here. It's just not evenly distributed." And I'll have to, and I think that's so true. I think if you could get like the listeners of this podcast together in a collective way, there's aspects in which a piece of which everyone's doing that are representative of the future, and it's here. And how do we kind of pull it all together? And that's a really exciting puzzle for me. And, lots of learning, I think, to be had from others, as a result.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting. I think with the, one of the biggest shifts in HR over the last, 5+ years was this evolution from, black box siloed work to open source and embracing kind of open practices and open standards in the field. And you're right. I mean, not that long ago, if you wanted to stay on top of a range of external news, you might have different publications that you follow or newspapers you read, et cetera. Now you still have that, but you can also follow, individuals who are curating the top resources on those specific fields. Like, what are they reading? And that they become discovery agents for new platforms. And it's just, I think for the curious mind right now who is really committed to learning and staying on top of things, there's never been a better time to hold that stance, because there's so much great information that can help inform the strategy. And I want to kind of going back to your work at Johnson & Johnson. You obviously led global talent management through the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic, and obviously something we're still experiencing, albeit in a different place, certainly than we were then. How did that impact your talent strategy? Because obviously you're operating on a global basis, you're operating at scale, you have to account for, regional spikes in terms of numbers and safety, employee safety in certain areas or other areas where you have employees. Looking back, were there any kind of tried and true HR people practices that were deeply entrenched, prior to the pandemic that, now are run in just a completely different way?
Yeah, I mean, I think as we look back on this time, and even as those that are in media that are documenting it, you hear a lot of greats, right? Not all positive, but sort of the great resignation or the great reimagination or the great reset. And I think the way I'd answer that question is, in some ways, COVID-19 was the great acceleration. And in terms of how we responded, I think it forced us in some respects to move things along. I mean, a good example of that is on learning and development is how quickly we transformed our content from in-person to digitally accessible. And that's stuff that we were already moving in that direction, but that sort of forced us overnight as people, had ebbs and flows of productivity and had opportunities to learn and grow over time. Like, we need to get to people, and that sort of accelerated things. I think to the second part of your question, the tried and true measures is a lot of people, myself included, the reason why we all get into HR is because we care about people. We want people to be happy. We want people to have successful careers and be happy at work. And, I think this element of empathy has served our function, sort of globally well, in that there's no playbook for this. No one could have forecast the impact on people's lives. And, I think how, in particular, people and people leaders have had to work through this shattering of what was a very fragile barrier of work and life, where all of a sudden it just became life, and you'd be zooming in and you could see someone's skateboards behind them and, their home environment. And how do you sort of navigate through what might have been, barriers that you wouldn't have crossed or been afraid to cross to get into it with people a little bit. And that when you ask them how they're doing, you really mean it. How are you doing today? How's your health? How's your family? Are you safe? So I think, so much has changed. I think it's been certainly challenging and devastating for many. I think as with any very difficult, challenging time, there's going to be learnings. There's going to be ways in which you can figure out to get better, how you can get better. And I think, some of that too is how do you maybe not bounce back to the way things were before? Because we've been doing sometimes things the same way for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, that last point I think is so important because you do start to see some. I think that there's a real nostalgia for the old way of working. Certainly from an executive standpoint, I think there's lots of people that would love to be able to go back in a time machine to the world of work in 2019. And I think the reality for those of us that are just paying attention, like that world is gone forever, right? We're building a new world, and yes, there will be some similarities to the old world, but there'll be lots of new things that didn't exist before. And it's made the field of HR an innovative field, right? Where I think historically, dens of innovation is typically not something that people would ascribe to the field of HR, yet that is exactly where the field is going. And I think best-in-class HR teams have been doing that for years, certainly before the pandemic, and now others are starting to catch on. And I'm curious for you, I mean, obviously you have a large global population, the remit of your role cuts across the majority of core strategic areas of HR. How do you think about innovation in an environment like that, particularly when you have so many different variables to factor in to what you may or may not do? I'd love to just get an inside window as to how you think about innovation in HR at a place like J&J.
Yeah, I mean, and I know, Lars, based on your background, your expertise in open source, I think this has evolved quite a bit. I mean, I think there was an analog previously, which is innovation needs to happen in a secure and almost ring-fenced environment where we're going to set aside resources or thought leaders or partners to focus, and we'll figure out an innovative solution versus, this aspect of innovation has and needs to happen everywhere. And one of the key things in roles like mine is not to create the innovation, but to do two things. And one is to create the space for innovation and then serve as this curator and connector, because my belief is the greatest innovation happens in closest proximity to the customer base, to the employee base, not necessarily in the corporate center. So how can we figure out that great work that's happening in the Philippines or in Sao Paulo or, in Tokyo, wherever it might be, and identify that as something that could be really exciting and transformative, and connect it through to make sure that it's being leveraged and worked upon. And it's kind of, how do you snowball an idea versus ring fence something and come out with a solution on the other end. And we've learned a ton, just sort of this different mindset of being more agile, and doesn't have to be perfect, and let's get a solution out there that may be minimally viable and kind of iterate that, because what happens is, it's not we take a year or two to create something and we launch it and then it's almost outdated. It's let's launch it and then invite the world, our community, our employee base to help us make it better. And I just think it's a very cool time from innovation. I think by the way, technology and the ability to access the data that we have has been an enormous catalyst of this. So we may not have been, even if we wanted to, we might not have been able to do this even 5-10 years ago.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think this general mindset shift towards like ship it and iterate, as opposed to having something fully baked, that's where this magic happens. Because I think often we may design the best programs in the world, but if we just kind of build them in a vacuum and then just stick them in front of our employees and say use this, there's going to be a lot of gaps. They're not going to feel like they're bought in. There may be certain things that we have obstructed views towards that we couldn't see based on our experience and background and all the things that come with that maybe they get their hands on. They're like, well, wait a minute, this doesn't work at all. And so when you can ship it, iterate it, get feedback, quickly kind of cycle through that, you just get such a stronger solution, but you're also able to kind of meet the market in a much more timely manner. which is pretty much how our operating model has to be these days. So, Michael, I really appreciate you walking me through your experience at Johnson & Johnson and helping the audience get to know more about your scope there. We close every episode with a lightning round just to help the audience get to know you a little bit better. And we always start with music. So I'm checking out wherever you stream music. Who will I learn are your top 3 artists?
Yeah, I'm going to sound probably more like an old soul, but by far and away, Bob Dylan's my favorite. I've always got some Dylan on. A big Elvis Costello fan. And I love jazz. So I think maybe if I had to round that out, whether it be Miles or Cannonball Adderley or Chet Baker, I mean, I can't get enough. So, but 8 out of 10 times, if I'm listening, it's probably Dylan.
All right. We're shifting to TV. What was your latest binge watch?
Geez, I don't know. Not binge like consecutive, but shows I'm watching that I'm not missing. I'm way into House of the Dragon right now. House of the Dragon's been good. It's fast moving. I feel like I made a mistake. I watched the first 3 episodes of Dahmer over the past few days, and that's pretty dark. So I'm almost wishing I hadn't gotten into that. But there's such great stuff on TV right now. It's challenging to try to fit it all in.
There is a lot. I haven't started Dahmer. I feel like I've read more of like the kind of backlash towards the programming than seen it myself. But House of Dragons definitely watching, and hopefully they'll listen to some of the audience feedback and move away from some of those dark.
Yeah, that's right. The dark imaging there. Yeah, the camera work. That's right.
So I know you started your career in finance. You transitioned over to HR. You can no longer do either of those things. If you were kind of starting your career now or pivoting, what would you be doing?
Well, Lars, actually, in secret, I haven't shared this very broadly. My secret ambition is I want to be the PA announcer for the New York Yankees or like a Major League Baseball or football team. And it's not the play-by-play or color. It's literally the person that announces, like the now batting, number 2, that kind of stuff. So I announced for a high school football team. I'm just waiting to be discovered, but that'll be the thing that pulls me out of HR. I love sports, and I have a lot of fun with that. I
mean, it sounds like you're ready for the call up.
Hey, maybe this podcast will connect me right to the right people, and you never know, right?
I don't know what our MLB and NFL executive demographic is on the audience side, but you never know. It's always possible. And Michael, last question for you. Who is one HR leader who you admire and why?
Geez, I know it's going to sound very, I don't know, almost not thought out. It's like sort of who's your hero, and you say your mom or dad, but one person is very close to home that means a lot to me. Her name's Luani Alvarado. So she's going to be the new head of our consumer health business once we formalize this separation, which we announced is going to be called Kenview. And I've worked with Luani for probably 20 years now across 2 companies. And, outside of being an outstanding HR leader, I've always been impressed and shaped quite a bit on how clearly she's able to prioritize things that are important. And I've been in meetings with her, with the CEO, and her kids call, and she always picks up, and she's sort of always there when you need her and always available. And I think, keeping the human part of human resources in place in this world where we're getting so advanced on the science and data and technology piece is really important. So I always look up to Luani Alvarado and her ability to balance that all.
Yeah. Well, Michael, I appreciate you making time to share your work and your career and just some of the projects you're working on at Johnson & Johnson. So thank you so much for making time for this.
Thanks for having me, Lars. Really appreciate you. Thanks.